thanks to Jonathan and Pastor Grant for the great imagery here. You see all of the fishes and the people fits right in to the theme of what Jesus was doing. But you know, that story is just the beginning of something incredible that happens in this passage. See, in the span of what appears to be just about 24 hours, the people around Jesus go from being so enthralled about who he is and what he's doing that they want to make him king instantly. And by the end of that 24-hour period, they are walking away in disillusion and disgust, grumbling about who he is. What happened in between? Well, let's take a look and see. But first, what was in your lunchbox when you went to school? For some of you from my era or before that, it was likely literally a lunchbox, maybe plastic or metal that you carried back and forth to school. And then as you got a little bit older and you got too cool for a lunchbox, it was probably in a brown paper bag. Nowadays, the kids just throw their lunch straight into a backpack. But when you were a kid in school, did you ever trade lunches or part of your lunches? Now, to be honest, my mustard and ketchup sandwiches on white bread, they didn't go over so well. They weren't worth too much. But I got to tell you, my mom's fresh baking, that always had high trading value. Well, anyways, back to the hillside. Can you imagine being the only one in a group of thousands and thousands of people, surrounded by people, and you're the only one with food? What was with everyone else? And maybe this boy's mom maybe loved him a whole lot more than the other people's moms did. I'm not sure. Anyway, this large group of people, they need to eat. And Jesus is about to feed them in ways that they couldn't even imagine. And in verse 5, we're going to jump back in there a little bit again. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" See, maybe Jesus was asking Philip specifically because he was a local. He grew up in that area. And if there were to be a corner store or a market, Philip would know about it. But he would also know exactly what wasn't there. And there wasn't anything for food. But then we continue on in verse 6. And it says that Jesus asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. See, I believe Jesus uses us to fulfill his purpose. And he gives us the opportunity to see beyond our ability. See, the tests of God, they're to refine our faith. It's never to tempt us into doing wrong. But when our faith is tested, how do we respond? See, Jesus knows what is going to happen already. We'll discover that as we continue through this chapter. And although we plan, and it's good to plan even throughout the day, we need to be prepared for the unexpected. In that moment that we didn't know was coming, to be God's grace and his love, his compassion, his understanding in that situation. And then we continue to verse 7. Philip answered him, "It would take almost a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to even have a bite." See, based on Philip's assessment of the situation and the inventory of their resources, which was very meager, he determined that the situation was, well, hopeless. But then Andrew appears. He goes, hey, look what I found. And we go, really? A few small loaves, a few small fish? Actually, it's laughable that this would feed 5, maybe even upwards of 10,000 people, with the families included with all these men. And as we read this verse here after Andrew speaks, he says, here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many? It's one of those times, have you ever had that moment where the thought of your mind is really good, and as soon as you speak it, you realize it's just really not even worth saying. It's almost like Andrew felt that way. And these reportedly small fish, they were maybe no larger than just a sardine. And yet, even if they would have been salmon, it wouldn't have made any difference. But see, that's when Jesus says, only a few small fish, a couple of loaves. Watch this. See, God is bigger, God is greater, and because He's bigger and greater than anything you or I have experienced before, then bigger and greater things are going to happen when we give what we have to God. So, here's my question for you. What is our response as a church when Jesus says, see these people all around you? They hunger. And we can say, but our resources are limited. There's only so much that we can do. And he says, well, what do you got? And sometimes individually we can say, well, Lord, I'm really not that good at doing a lot of stuff. I'm not sure what I have to give you. And then Jesus says, that's why we make such a good team. I can do a lot with your little. And he says, let's go. See, seeing beyond our ability, because it's not us. It's Jesus within us. And Jesus has more than enough. We read in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 20, that things we are able through Jesus to accomplish infinitely more than we could ask or think what Jesus can do. Sometimes it doesn't seem like we have much to give. What can this little do? Well, you'll be amazed what can be done as we give it to Jesus. And then after this incredible feast on this hillside, Jesus just disappears. He leaves. Because he knew they were after something that he wasn't prepared to give them. They wanted to make him king right then and there. But he said no. And then the story continues. In John chapter 6, verse 16 to 21. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed about 3.5 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I. Don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. You know, as George Costanza would say, the sea was angry that day, my friend. The Sea of Galilee was a little over 5 miles across at this point. And storms were common on this large lake as the winds howled through the hills to the north. And it made me think, when we are caught up in the storms of life, even when we think we're prepared, it's still such a challenge to make any headway. These experienced fishermen had been rowing for hours. And normally what would maybe take them an hour or so to cross this whole part of the lake, for hours they had been battling this storm. And they were only part way across, with great difficulty. And then Jesus appears as if out of nowhere. And he says, "It is I. Don't be afraid. Don't worry. Don't be anxious. Don't be frightened." For we discover that even though they were only halfway across the lake, once he joined them, they appeared on the other side through the storm. You know, Jesus will get us, will get you through the storm. He will get us to the other side. See, it doesn't mean we won't have to face the storm or to be caught within it for a time. But he will get us through. And though your storm may be dark, just hold on. For maybe that's, in that moment of time, maybe that's all you're capable of doing. But know that he is near, and he says, "It is I. Don't be afraid." And so they continue on. They land on the shores of Capernaum, and it's the next day. And not long after they arrive, the crowd catches up to them. And they continue to seek what Jesus has to give. And he says to them in verse 29, "You need to believe in the one that God has sent." It all starts with belief, with who I am and why I am here. And then we discover that in verse 30, they asked him, "Well, what sign then will you give that we may see it and believe?" The people were saying, "Show us a sign so we might believe. I will believe when I see it." But Jesus is saying, no, you've got it backwards. Believe in me, and then you will see. See, no doubt we're familiar with the saying, seeing is believing. But this is a case where believing leads to seeing. And it's as we believe in Jesus that we then see who he is and what he has come to do. See, for Jesus, filling their stomachs was far less important than filling their souls. We discovered that a few weeks ago with the water and satisfying the thirst. But really, this whole miracle on the mountainside, giving them food, was just setting up what Jesus really wanted to give them, to feed them. But what he was about to suggest to them was so bizarre that many of his followers turned and left, never to return again. In verse 35, he makes the declaration, I am the bread of life. See, he has filled their stomachs with bread, and they're still asking, what are you going to do? And he says, I am the bread of life. Now, this is a very interesting statement, and it is the first of 7 I am statements that Jesus makes throughout the book of John. So watch for the others as we continue. And he says that if you feed on me, you will hunger no longer. Our spiritual longing for God will be satisfied. The very words of Jesus nourish, speak life into our soul. You know how when you're eating and you take one bite, and it's just so good, and you just need more? Well, the other day, Jenny made a banana loaf with the girls were over, and by the time I got home, there was only one slice left, and I was quite disappointed. So she then made me today, and you can see it here, this loaf of bread, and it's actually chocolate bread. And I got to tell you, next to the bread of life, this is probably the next best thing. And I also have to say that I'm really sorry for those of you who don't like bread, or because maybe you, for a health reason, you're not able to enjoy it. But there is nothing like fresh baked bread. And if it's chocolate bread, I wish you could experience this. It is tremendous. Again, when we can get together, the invitation is to come join us eating some chocolate bread. Bread is awesome. Oh, I love it. And it's interesting that Jesus uses this analogy. He fills the people's stomachs with bread. And he says, but true bread from heaven is spiritual. And he says, take a taste. Consume God's word. It will give you nourishment for your soul. Feed on Jesus. See, all of us have a need to be filled. And we can seek it through so many different ways. So many different ways that will not satisfy. And if we feed our acceptance on what we get from others, we will constantly be starving. See, we just can't get from others what we can get from Jesus. And if our sustenance is from those around us, we will be disappointed because it just won't satisfy. And unfortunately, now in our current world of social media, we need to be very, very careful of seeking fulfillment in our life from how many likes our posts get or how many followers that we have. Listen to this. There's been studies on this and the effect that has, the dependence on who's following us and how many people are liking what we say. Scientists now link the dopamine that floods our brain, that rush that we get when we see likes on our social media posts, to the hit that the human brain receives from addictive narcotics like cocaine. It gives an incredible rush, but it's an addiction that leads to always wanting more, and it leaves us wanting. So be careful, even in that area, how we seek to fulfill ourselves. Now, that doesn't mean I don't like seeing your posts and your encouragement in the faces of your family. Let's be very careful on what we need from social media. And then the really incredible thing, one of the coolest things that Jesus says, that as we come to Him, as we feed on Him, no matter who we are or what is happening in our life, in verse 37, He says, all whom the Father gives to me will come to me, and whoever comes to me, I will never drive away. Jesus will never reject you. We will never be rejected by Jesus. Jesus didn't come to condemn. He didn't come to berate us or to beat us up for what we have done. Jesus came to receive us, to restore us. No matter who we are, or where we've come from. But then Jesus goes a little bit deeper with his whole analogy of eating, consuming. And he continues in verse 53, and he says to them, very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you will have no life in you. And he continues to push this. And it was difficult to understand. See, in that moment, this was heresy. He's calling himself sent from God. He's calling himself the Son of God. And then he says, now you need to eat me. And it sounded literal. Now, we have the benefit of the rest of Scripture and the rest of his words. And as we gather for communion, and I know I was just talking to somebody actually earlier today, and we're talking about missing that opportunity to gather for communion, and we're working on ways to do that together as a church as soon as we can. But see, we understand that the bread and the juice, the wine, are symbolic of Jesus' body and his blood. And yet they didn't understand. They couldn't come to terms with what he was saying. And that's why in verse 66, we read that the disciples were grumbling about this and saying, this is a hard teaching. Who can accept it? And from this time, many of the disciples turned back and no longer followed him. They turned away and deserted him. Jesus, this is just too much. We're out of here. Eat your body, drink your blood. That doesn't even make sense. We don't even know what you're talking about. And they left. But what is too much for us? When do we feel that, Jesus, you're just asking too much? Well, Jesus doesn't ask for much, does he? Well, just your life. But it's a pretty good deal. His death so that you may live. It doesn't get better than that. And all he calls us to do is die to our sinfulness and selfishness and live for him. See, I firmly believe, we believe that the church, the gathering, should be a safe place for all who enter. But it should not be necessarily a comfortable place. The radical love and ministry and calling of Jesus should push us out of our comfort zone. To follow him, this radical message in this world that so desperately needs the bread of life. So why is it that some people just walk away from Jesus? maybe they think he's asking too much. Maybe they say, well, religion isn't for me. Well, you know what? Religion isn't for me either. It's a relationship with Jesus that I'm excited about. Or just maybe some people have walked away from the church because we have done a poor job of reflecting who Jesus is. And that's painful to admit. But that can be the reality when we focus more on rules than on relationship. God calls us to love. And unfortunately, I talk to people regularly, say, well, I was really hurt by the church. And then they explain their circumstance. And the invitation is to come to Jesus, to have a relationship with Jesus. And within the church, we want to celebrate that. And we want to help each other grow and reach out and share the love and the compassion of Jesus to our world. And it's interesting that after this large group of his followers says, that's it, we're done. Jesus then turns, and in verse 67, he says, do you want to leave also? He asked the remaining 12. Do you want to go as well? Everybody else is leaving me. I love Peter's reply. He says, where else would we go? We have nobody else to follow. There is no one but you. There is no one else whose life is worth following. You know what? If anyone says to you, follow me, and they're not following Jesus, turn around. If we have a commitment that says, I will follow, there is no one else. There is no one else in this world that is worth following. We will discover the restoration, the replenishment, that Jesus revives us, bringing us close to him. That is consuming the bread of life that Jesus offers each one of us. Our God, we thank you for this day, this opportunity to gather around your word. God, and as we continue to gather and around the table for many of us, and today and in the days to come, God, as we partake of the meal that's provided and prepared, God, maybe as we even consume the bread, may it be a reminder of the bread of life. God, that we will have to come back to the table and eat this bread for our physical bodies. But the bread you give us will sustain us forever. And yet, God, may we continue desire to keep coming back to your word and be replenished and restored and revived through your very words, through the bread of life, through yourself, through your Son, Jesus Christ. God, may we also take this bread to those around us as we continue to seek ways, God, that are even beyond our ability to think, but knowing that as we give what we have, and sometimes we think it's not much, and you say, that's perfect. That's all I need. And together, let's go bring this to the world so they may see my great love, be drawn close to me. God, continue with us this day. In your precious Son's name, amen. It's been great discovering the Word with you today. And in just a moment, we're going to jump into some extra thoughts that we can consider about the bread of life. See you soon.
Hey, thanks Cedar Valley for joining us again this morning. It's been a great morning. Thank you for the message, Pastor Doug, in John chapter 6. And a huge thing that we want to just really advocate for is that this isn't something like, don't just watch this and think that now your life is changed, right? Like there's some more that we want out of this kind of stuff. We're kind of providing some content. We want to interact with it. We want to explore, ask questions, and see how that applies specifically to all of our lives. And so with that, we're gonna engage you in a little bit of conversation to take this into the rest of your afternoon and week and month and so on from here. So John chapter 6, Doug.
So just following up with that, what's a verse or a truth from the Bible that nourishes your soul?
Okay.
Yeah.
Could you even like expand on that just a little bit more of like, is this the whole Bible, stuff like that? Like stuff that we have memorized maybe from being kids or that we heard this morning?
Well, you know what? Sometimes I think there's that verse when you memorize as a kid and it's still back there, right?
Okay.
And you kind of refer to that. Or maybe there's a time where just, wow, I was reading, last week and I just discovered maybe God in a new, fresh way. And I found that more than just words on a page, but it really went into my heart.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I do have some that I memorized as a kid, but it changes. Like even as an adult, and sometimes I feel like I've encountered certain passages for the first time, and it's not even a specific one. But what's been speaking to me lately, I know, I even talked about this week for a devotional was so many times, especially when we're going to see it in the Gospel of John, Jesus doesn't call himself God, but he uses almost what I always thought, like, when I was trying to look at this academically, because that's the criticism, like, well, he never said he was actually God. And he's like, he actually did in so many ways, but he never demanded, it's like, well, call me God. And instead he uses little, like, unique things of, like, saying, well, are you the Son of God? Well, what does my testimony say about me?
Yes.
And more, I kind of thought of that of like, what cool ways then of identifying your character. Jesus identified who he was explicitly without demanding to be called it by name. Instead, he's like, let my life show you, let my work show you, let my Father, the God who's in heaven, show you.
That's incredible. And for me, one of the things that a verse that I had from younger, and actually was my baptism verse in Proverbs chapter 3, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding, and he will direct your paths. And it's a comfort to me. It nourishes me in the fact that I know God is there to direct me. I still have to take the steps. I still need the motivation to get up and go. And yet God says, as you're moving, I will direct you where I want you to go, what's best for your life.
Right, so you gotta move.
You gotta move. It's kind of that old illustration that if you're sitting in a car in a parking lot, it's hard to turn that steering wheel.
Right.
But get it moving at even 5K, and it's much easier to steer. So we have to get up and move.
Sure. So what the question was, I'll let you rephrase that again.
Just what is it that about the Bible, a verse or just a truth that really nourishes you and kind of lifts you up?
Excellent, thank you.
And then the other one that we can think of a little bit here, we say, well, show me and I'll believe. And so many people in Jesus' day said the same thing. Well, show us another miracle. What else are you going to do for us? And he said, no. He says, if you really believe in me, then you will see. They say, show us, let us see, then we'll believe. He says, no, the other way around. So when you think of, because you believe in Jesus, what have your eyes been open to? What do you see now because of your faith, because of your belief?
Right. That one is, that idea, I often feel almost bothered. I get triggered by this idea because I have friends and I know people with amazing testimonies where they've seen angels, they've seen miracles happen in front of their eyes and transformations, and I haven't. And I've been frustrated with it. And I've many times gone in prayer and said, like, God, come on, give me something. Like, let me see the thing, right? And then I always have a clear, distinct thing. It's like, you don't need that. You don't need to see the things that they might have needed, but whatever. Not even that it's a better or worse thing, but like, you don't need that connection. And then half the time after, I'll say to myself, okay, so I had a conversation with God and I'm still asking for a sign. Come on. And then out of that, it mostly just let me see God in other people's lives, clearly at work, when I see a person make a decision that there's no business they had making that decision on their own, or a transformation in their life, or a change of heart or emotion. So I think that was a conversation I had with God that helped me see God at work constantly in other people's lives in what seemed like the subtle ways, right? I think God is telling me, like, you don't need the big show, because the subtle stuff is actually what's changing everybody's lives and your life constantly.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's that belief when we commit ourselves to, yes, I believe in the Son of God, Jesus Christ, and his testimony, then, that just removes, my need to, okay, God, well, I need to see this. And there's an element of faith that kind of takes us through that. And it can be very strong. And while it's great to see revelations of God in a physical way, that faith is very, very strong within us. That helps us to see the greatness of God because we are committed to believing in him.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. We're going to post these questions up on the screen for you to engage in for just a few moments. You can pause them too if you want more time, because I think it actually is worthwhile discussion to have. Engage online with the comments, everyone. You can phone up a friend if you got your small group. Get some Skype or Zoom going too. But just take this, wrestle with it. And thank you for joining us this morning. We will see you next week.
See you next week, Cedar Valley.